And that's something that we've noted before too, sort of these objects that have close proximity to one another is maybe more indicative of something that may be related to the Samoan Clipper. Taking a quick look at our handy dandy world map, we have some viewers from all over the world. It's really, really cool to see those of you across the United States, from Hawaii to the East Coast, and then up in Canada. Hello, guys. The United Kingdom, Netherlands, Germany, Sweden, Russia, Poland, New Zealand, Norway. Who else do we have here? Japan, Finland, Denmark, and Australia. Thanks for joining us, everyone. This is really, really exciting as we continue side scan sonar mapping of the bottom of the seafloor here just off the coast of American Samoa. We have Argus operating at a depth of about 3,000 meters. So our work now is surveying an area of about 2 square miles, which is just over 5 kilometers squared. When we're chugging along in this lawnmower pattern style that you can see in the bottom left quadrant on the live feed. That green line is Argus. So Argus is down there solo for this part of the mission. He is looking at the bottom of the ocean, and then of course mapping out about 100-meter radius from either side. And our work here is to pick up on any objects that the sonar detects that might be more indicative of human-made objects. So those are characterized by ones that have harder or longer straight lines, right angles, sort of features that you don't necessarily see in nature. And we just marked our 44th target as we were approaching a rocky edge. Dee Dee described it as a grouping of several smaller objects, some with parallel lines connecting them. So we're on our 5th line here, finishing up, and then we'll scan the rest of this one and the remaining 4 in this southerly section of the survey area. And then we'll take Argus back up to the northern part, and we'll pass over a couple of targets that are of interest using that video camera on Argus. We'll get eyes on them to see, if they are indeed part of the Samoan Clipper or, geological features. And then once we determine those parts that we deem the most promising, we'll send Hercules down to do a more in-depth analysis and get a better visual exactly of what we're working with. For those of you who haven't heard, we are searching for the Samoan Clipper. It was an S-42B aircraft that was captained by Ed Musick, and during a mail carry route from Honolulu to Auckland, New Zealand, it went down on the 11th of January 1938. So researchers have spent the last 5 years going through archival documentation and accident reports, one eyewitness account, to determine this area as the likely final resting place of the Samoan Clipper. And so that brings us here to modern day. And what we're looking at on that top left quadrant, that is the side scan sonar. So they're both operating at different frequencies. One is 600 and the other is 300, and that just adds a little bit more variety in terms of, you know, what we can pick up on the seafloor, and then our team will pull those together and analyze them to, you know, get a better idea of those 44 targets that we've marked, and then, you know, add that to the list of those really promising targets that we're going to explore in greater detail. And this is, as I mentioned, an Argus-only operation, so it's a little bit unique in that we have Argus and the sonar attached to it. So Argus is running along the middle, and that's sort of that black line right down the middle of both of those sonar maps that you see. So we have a visual of the seafloor there, and then the side scan sonar, as its name gives it away, is giving those sonar mapping of about 100 meters out to either side. And so the combination of the two is giving us a very good idea of what we're looking at below, you know, what's below the surface of the ocean. We have a question for the ROV crew. Has Argus ever been equipped with a metal detector or anything of that sort? I mean, would that help in sort of an expedition of this nature?
It would find itself in a hurry. So the short answer is no, it has not been equipped with a metal detector. You could, I suppose, design like a plastic-only sled or tow sled, but Argus is most definitely not that.
Or trail a magnetometer behind Argus.
And I don't think we've done anything like that.
Not with Argus on Nautilus, but it has been done.
Is it tandem off a tow sled, or is it its own thing?
Typically it's its own thing.
Yeah.
You can sort of trail it behind the side scan, so you have one cable and then the side scan, and then it trails off behind it.
Really? Okay.
Yeah.
And Didi, what are we doing with all of this data mapping once we're done with it? I mean, do we stitch it together and make like a super duper complete map of the search site, you know, or is it just sort of data as it is?
Yeah, so the nice thing about the processing software, as it collects all of these individual lines, it will mosaic them together. So it will put one after the other, including the turns, to create a larger overall map of the area. And that's where you really get to see the interesting geologic features, since they could span, you know, hundreds of meters long. Similar to this background map that we're using for navigation, it's just more detailed. So we will be able to produce a larger overall mosaic of the survey area.
And then that sort of, you know, in addition to the work that we're doing in searching for the Samoan Clipper, contributes to this greater body of work in mapping the bottom of the ocean, right?
That is correct.
And then with that 44th target that we just marked, you know, one of the key descriptors that you used was its close proximity to one another, or, you know, the several objects and their close proximity. And what does that sort of tell us? Why are we excited about those sorts of objects as opposed to these other sort of solitary ones that we've seen?
Well, I believe we're expecting to find not only larger intact pieces of the plane, but also a debris field of the smaller items, either that came off during the explosion that ultimately sank the plane, or its descent to the seafloor. So that's why those several groupings are of interest at this point. So we'll sit and compare them and see how it lays out over the larger survey area with the other targets in mind.
And we're not necessarily, you know, looking to recover the Samoan clipper, or at least, you know, the next step is sort of out there. But when these larger recovery efforts do take place, what sort of techniques and methods are used to bring heavy objects back to the surface, you know, particularly ones that may have been damaged in their descent down to the bottom of the ocean?
That is where the skill of the Hercules pilots and other ROV pilots come into play with their manipulator arms. They can recover things not only with the arms, but with little suction devices for items that are incredibly fragile. They will be delicately picked up and put into storage containers for their ascent. I've actually never been on board for a recovery of anything, so that's sort of a learning experience that I'd like to be part of at some point in the future. But it's basically due to the skill of the ROV pilots and the navigators to do that sensitive work.
So ROV pilots, have you all mastered those quarter machines where you send the grabby arm down to get stuffed animals?
They're rigged.
If an ROV pilot can't get it,
Can't be done.
it can't be done. And again, like as we're kind of considering all of the possibilities of how the Samoan clipper made its way down to the bottom of the ocean, you know, what's our debris field? What do we have any idea of what that might have looked like in terms of, you know, would it have been very, very wide depending on where the explosion occurred? Would currents maybe have affected where these different pieces landed? You know, there's a lot of variables to consider.
Yeah, the feeling is that if, as was reported, the aircraft, you know, was very low. It was in the process of landing when the detonation occurred. So it was at, you know, relatively, you know, low altitude and low speed, and so, you know, the wreckage at the surface anyway was, you know, likely fairly tightly concentrated, you know, and in some cases held together, you know, enough so that it would sink completely. The one witness testimony indicates that the wing was still intact and floated for a time at the surface before disappearing from sight, and which makes some sense in that we know that that is the strongest piece on the airplane by design, and you know, what happened to that debris, that wreckage, once it left the surface is pure speculation, and it would have, you know, fallen, you know, nearly 2 miles to the sea floor. But we do expect it. You know, it could have you know, separated the pieces, the components, but not scattered over a huge area like you would expect if the explosion had happened at altitude and the pieces had kind of, you know, showered down from several thousand feet up before they ever impacted the surface of the water and then began to sink. So you know, the largest likely piece is the wing, which was constructed all of one piece, two spar stress skin construction, immensely strong, and measuring with a wingspan of 118 feet 2 inches and 13 feet across. So that is most likely the largest target that we could hope to encounter. I think the tail section being, you know, furthest removed from the point of the explosion could well have separated and survived substantially intact. The cockpit section as well may have sheared away and be resting, you know, on its own as well. And then the center section where the explosion occurred, there would probably be, you know, smaller disarticulated components that are, and interior fixtures and things that would have been scattered about. So you know, but it's still, you know, speculation until we find something, and then we'll know. But you know, the only way to know is to go and look.
I have a question. If this was hard bottom covered with a thin layer of sediment, would that still be reflective on the screen, or?
If the sediment was covering the hard bottom, it would not penetrate past the sediment level. Yeah.
Even though if it was a thin layer of sediment?
My understanding is the sonar will only pick up objects that protrude above the seafloor. Yeah, so you would need different frequencies of sonar to penetrate the sediment level.
Sub-bottom. Okay.
Yeah.
What other sort of wreckage sites has the same technology been deployed? You know, the side scan sonar, and is side scan sonar different than, you know, regular old-fashioned sonar that maybe just goes straight down to the bottom of the ocean? I mean, are there different sort of sonar capabilities?
Yeah, there are definitely different types of sonar capabilities based upon the frequency that they use and the types of transducers they're positioning. Like a fish finder is basically a sonar system, or a depth sounder that most boats have. That is a simplified sonar that just pings directly down, bounces off, and will give you your depth. Now, consumers can go to their local store and buy similar side scan sonars that they can mount to their vessels. Many fishermen use them for finding fish in the water column. So side scan sonar, or sonar in general, is used for a variety of reasons, not only for the scientific community, but for oil and gas. They have sonars that can penetrate the seafloor to look for gas deposits and oil deposits. So it's scientific and commercial and just recreational uses, as technology is getting less expensive and easier to use.
But I can tell you that this exact technology has been used before by Nautilus to locate ancient shipwrecks was it in the Mediterranean?
I believe the Black Sea.
In the Black Sea, and that effort was led you know, by our own Mike Brennan, who is on this ship with us, and was at the time working with Ocean Exploration Trust, and is now you know, with Search Incorporated. But yeah, we were actually privileged to have Dr. Ballard join us here on the Science Party line earlier in the morning, and he pointed out that Mike has probably found more ancient shipwrecks than anyone else, and using technology very much like this, and you know, from deployed side scan sonar deployed on Argus as a tow sled.
Wow, that's a pretty impressive claim to fame. That's really cool.
Yeah, the anoxic waters in the Black Sea would allow to preserve the wooden parts of the ancient shipwrecks.
Yeah, I understand in some cases the you could see the marks from the adze, the tools, you know, where they shaped the wood, and that there were, you know, at least the stub of masts protruding, you know, from the seabed. So pretty remarkable stuff.
And then you know, obviously in addition to this sonar technology, we have the ability to get eyes on whatever it is that's at the seafloor. And, you know, the general consensus is the Samoan Clipper suffered an in-flight explosion. And, you know, what sort of indications that we can see would allow us to definitively say that that is what happened or that is what occurred? You know, are there certain things that we're looking for above others?
Well, yeah, I think what we're trying to determine. I mean, the investigators concluded that it was a fire and explosion of undetermined origin. So what hopefully we can do is gather those last clues to shed light on what ultimately was the cause of that ignition that doomed the plane. And there were several theories that were advanced, have been advanced over the years. You know, at the time, a lot of the suspicion fell mainly on the dumping process itself, dumping the fuel. The plane was known to be had been reported that they were intending to shed excess weight before landing by dumping fuel overboard, and the dump valves themselves were mounted flush to the underside of the wing, and then just spring loaded and tripped by pulling a lever and that would open the valves and just allow the fuel to drain through gravity. But an unfortunate consequence of that was that it seems that the vortices generated by the airflow over the wing would tend to cause the fuel to flow forward and back on along the wing or even inside the wing structure and into the cabin of the airplane itself. And the thought was that perhaps the fuel or fuel vapors made contact with the hot engine exhaust and was ignited that way. Another other speculation centered on the electric flap actuators as they're triggered before landing. Though that seems less likely in that the plane was still in the process of dumping and probably wouldn't be configured for the final landing approach at that point. Other thoughts were a static charge. They don't believe it was the radio, because the operator had announced specifically that he was powering down to reduce that risk that a stray spark from the radio set would ignite the fuel vapors that could result from that process. Something that's caught my attention is that the accident report talks about the appearance that the fuel that the fire may have originated underneath the flooring of the auxiliary fuel compartment. There were 6 225-gallon tanks mounted inside the hull in what was passenger compartment D, directly beneath the wing. And you can imagine that the shock of landing and takeoff could put a lot of strain on those tanks, and if they developed even a small leak, that amount of fuel could collect in what amounts to the bilges of what is a flying boat, and collect underneath the flooring in that compartment, and also we know that in order to drain those tanks, the hull-mounted tanks had no direct method to drain them. If you wanted to lose any of that fuel, you first needed to pump it into the wing tanks. The standard aircraft only carried fuel in its wings, and so that's why the dump valves were mounted there. And so since the only dump valves on the airplane, even the modified version, were just the standard placement in the wings, that you would first need to pump out the hull tanks into the wing tanks and then overboard. And according to a document that was found for us by the the researchers at the Igor Isikorsky Historical Archives that show the fuel system, the special fuel system for the S-42B. Beneath the flooring of that compartment was a fuel pump that had both a manual and an electric
locking carabiner for the
pump.
harness.
So you could think that if a small, even a small amount of fuel had gathered, leaked and gathered into those bilges, and fuel vapors built up, and then this electric fuel pump is activated, and
there wasn't
and
a
is
locking
unshielded,
carabiner on there last
and
time we used
just
it.
generates even just a stray spark.
There's just the clip-in
that could be
thing.
enough to set off that fuel vapor and a sympathetic explosion. Then
one has a clip
propagates to the tanks
this
themselves
big with a spring-loaded
destroys
thing.
the airplane.
Yeah, mine's like
But
a locking.
so yeah, so if
beamer.
we are fortunate enough to find the wreck itself,
so
we can
it
look
was on
for
sale at REI, but
we
you
can
would
look
never
for
take that climb.
signs of that, particularly on the wing. If the fuel was ignited by the hot engine exhaust, you would expect to find some kind of charring on the surface of the wing itself. So if we find that, then that would be a good indication that original suspicion was the correct one. But if there's an absence, a total absence of charring or scoring on the upper wing, then we'll need to consider other possibilities. I imagine that if that fuel pump really was the cause, it would also have been really at the center of the explosion, and the traces of that may well have been obliterated. But who knows, if you find sections of that section of the hull and it's blown outwards, then perhaps that does confirm that theory. So, or maybe we find new clues that point in a direction that nobody's even considered yet.
Yeah, that'd be something.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
And we do have among our scientists ashore, we have Mark Smith, who spent a 35-year career investigating aircraft accidents for Boeing, and he will be an extra pair of eyes, and is actually trying to recruit experts in flammability as well to assist with that evaluation.
Oh, great. So, we have a pretty stout team here on board, and then we also have, our scientists back at shore who are able to contribute to this, defining what really happened and maybe closing the book on this chapter.
Absolutely.
I'm looking at a photo shared by New Zealand History, and it shows the Samoan Clipper at Mechanics Bay in New Zealand, and then behind it is Imperial Airways flying boat Centaurus. So it's interesting that there were this sort of idea of flying boats wasn't necessarily just at Pan Am, and looking at the two, they are very similar. They have sort of this big hole in the front and very large wings, but there are kind of different nuances in how it's designed. And why did multiple aircraft makers build flying boats? What sort of prompted that?
Well, they were both built by different companies and operated by their essentially their national flag carriers. So Imperial Airways is for the Brits, carrying their flag, across the seas, and so Pan American was really the U.S. Our in the United States the flagship carrier, and they would naturally be equipped in most cases with the aircraft that were constructed in their own home countries. And I'm sorry to say I don't recall the actual make and model of Centaurus, which was the individual name for that flying boat, whether it was a short aircraft. I'm going to look that one up, after my watch. But yeah, so certain it was a British-made aircraft, and the French carriers would have their own manufacturers, and the Italians were building flying boats. The Germans, so a lot of these a lot of the countries, especially that had a robust aviation industry, would have their own manufacturers that would create these machines for them to traverse the oceans, and there was a great deal of prestige and not only national pride but a lot of practical benefit in stimulating air travel by the different countries, which is why they would provide incentives in terms of subsidies for flying the mail, and to make it possible for these companies to develop.
Russ?
Yes.
Russ, it's a short S-23 Empire.
Thank you very much, Megan Licklider-Munden.
All right, Megan.
Yes, Megan has made it her mission to specialize in aircraft structures, conservation of materials, and especially submerged aircraft structures, and made a study of flying boats. So we had one of the world experts right here on the ship with us. So thank you for ringing in with that.
Well,
so at least I knew it was a
also
short.
Not to take a whole lot of credit, but I do have internet access down here, so so there's that.
Yes. Well, you knew where to look anyway, but at least I knew it was a short, that was the manufacturer. But yeah, so, and yes, that was a big day in New Zealand, in Auckland, when those two aircraft were there together. And I should say Samoan Clipper arrived first. It was there the day before, and had been there previously, in March and April of the same year, and then in December arrived with the first for the first regularly scheduled service, beating Imperial Airways by a single day, but which helped to cement Music's reputation in New Zealand. In a lot of ways, he is better remembered, down under, or well, no, I guess that would be Australia, but he's better remembered in New Zealand in many ways than he is in the United States.
And then, yeah, and going back to sort of this, the day of the accident, your team and has a good idea of sort of what happened based on this eyewitness account, and then of course BAC accident report and Navy correspondence and radiograms and newspaper clippings. Like there's you brought aboard 2 massive binders filled with all of this archival information. Do you have sort of an idea, what's your best guess as to whether the aircraft was still in the air or on the water when the explosion occurred?
It sounds like, and in the words of the Bureau of Air Commerce report, that Music had detected the fire and had begun or even had nearly completed an emergency landing. So the plane was either just above the surface of the water or in the process of landing when the detonation happened, and the crew was overwhelmed. So yeah, so my feeling is that yes, the plane was just at the surface of the water, whether or not it had made contact, and from both from the eyewitness account, saying that the airplane had dove for the water and was had just, to her eyes, looked as if it was had begun to land, or the fact that it was really only small pieces of aircraft that were found, and from a relatively few compartments inside the airplane, led the inspectors or the investigators at the time to conclude that the airplane had been in the process of landing, had been at relatively low altitude and low speed, and had only the damage was done. The catastrophic damage was done in that center compartment and to the compartments immediately adjacent. So that the explosion happens in the auxiliary fuel compartment, compartment D, and propagates into the navigator station and the crew compartments and the compartment just aft of the fuel tanks as well.
And when investigators got to the scene, how did they describe it? Were there actually parts of the aircraft there, or was it just a handful of personal effects that were floating on the surface?
Well, they found an oil slick and then also, yes, smaller bits of pieces of charred wood and flooring and partitioning board and bits of paper, text from the navigator station, a great quantity of aluminum powder, which was inside, actually contained in the navigator's drift targets that they would use to calculate their drift, where they would drop these kind of glass containers that were shaped like sort of football-sized bombs with tail fins on them that they would drop from the airplane, and it would break on the surface of the ocean and then give them a relative target that they could track the effect of the wind on the airplane. And so those apparently were shattered when the explosion occurred and the crash, and so it scattered it, and a lot of this aluminum powder was floating on the surface. And then a couple of items of clothing, the jacket, the radio officer's jacket with the Pan American wings still affixed, and the assistant engineer's trousers with a bent tie clasp in the pocket that was identified as belonging to Jack Brooks, and the jacket to Tom Finley, the radio operator. So, though it was related to me that the crew didn't typically, when they were operating in areas like this, kind of out of the public eye, and not carrying passengers, that they wouldn't necessarily wear their dress uniforms during the flight. They would change into, some coveralls or something like that. So it was not likely actually that the men were wearing these items when the plane went down.
And do we know where those objects are now?
Not. We've tracked them through newspaper accounts and radiograms as far as San Francisco. So they were collected on the scene by the crew of the Avocet, the U.S. Navy seaplane tender that was stationed at Pongo Pongo and conducted the initial search. And so they were picked up the following day after the crash, and there's a photograph in from the New Zealand Herald of a small bag being carried ashore from Avocet that was said to contain all the items that they had recovered. There's radiograms relating that the contents of that bag had been given to the master of a Matson Line steamship that was headed back to California, and we're going to be locked in his safe and then turned over to Pan American officials in San Francisco. And there's a San Francisco Examiner newspaper article, something about like Samoan Clipper relics, arrive, and how this container was turned over to the Pan American officials, who would then give it over to the Bureau of Air Commerce and for their evaluation and to assist in the writing of the report. So that's as far as we've tracked it. And that's just later in January, early February of 1938, and what became of it after that, we don't know. My suspicion is that they were probably destroyed. Once once their usefulness in furthering the investigation, were at an end. I don't think anyone at the time envisioned that it would be possible to continue the investigation from that point. So, maybe it would have just been seemed macabre to hang on to these objects any longer. So, but who knows? Maybe they're in some warehouse somewhere, with the lost ark, and just waiting to be re-examined.
Best case scenario.
Right, right.
Absolutely. And to our knowledge, there are no S-42 aircrafts around anymore today.
There are no examples of the Sikorsky S-42 in any museum or collection anywhere in the world. There were only 10 ever built, and I think only 5 of them survived through the end of World War II. The rest were lost in accidents like what befell Samoan Clipper, but also some landing accidents in the Caribbean. And so by 1946, there was only 5 of them remaining, and they were at that time they were outmodeled, outmoded, and obsolete. The world had moved on. There was already blindingly fast development in aeronautical engineering throughout the 1930s, and then that only accelerated through World War II, and the need to produce these airplanes and to with greater and greater performance, and to move them around the world, and to move supplies, and so these air routes were developed, and overland air routes, and more efficient land planes with longer ranges, and the airfields to accommodate them. And so the era of the great flying boat had really passed, or was certainly waning at the end of World War II, and the S-42 was an older design by then. Was they'd been manufactured more than 10 years earlier, which in aviation years especially then was quite old. It's kind of like having a 10-year-old iPhone at that point. So so they were either scrapped, or we've heard some rumors of them being towed off of Miami and disposed of. There's one newspaper article from 1947 that talks about one individual who, facing a shortage of real estate in Florida, decided the best option was to live on a houseboat, and came up with a clever solution that he had a ready-made boat by purchasing one of the surplus Samoan, or sorry, not Samoan, but one of the surplus Clippers, one of the surplus S-42s, and it was actually the Brazilian Clipper, the original S-42, that was purchased and converted into a houseboat, shorn of its wings and tail, and made look like a pretty cozy little floating house. But whatever became of it in the intervening years, we just don't know. It's been 72 years since the last anybody knew anything of it. So it's nice to imagine that it's still floating in some backwater in Florida somewhere, waiting to be preserved. But I would have thought we'd have heard something about it by now. So
Yeah. Well,
yeah.
if you're listening.
Yes, if you're listening and
Let us know.
you got somebody that's living in this strange plane boat in Florida, write in and let us know.
That's right. You can tweet us at EV Nautilus. Yeah, very, very cool. Lots of history, and it goes to show as well, we're looking for this one aircraft that has this very sort of deep, emotional history connected with it, but it was also at the beginning, or towards the beginning of the aviation industry, and it really sort of, all of this work that happened 80 years ago, kind of led us to where we are in terms of getting around the world and communication systems that we have and maybe take for granted every day. And, you know, it's really sort of just all connected.
Yeah, Pan Am really invented, you know, ocean travel and long distance, you know, air transport, and innovated a lot of what makes it possible now. You know, by having their own dedicated weather reporting along the routes, and committing to the development of radio communication, where you could make the radio sets portable enough to and light enough and small enough to be carried on an airplane, and yet still powerful enough to be heard over the great distances that they were operating, and also incorporating radio direction finding to hone their navigation and make it possible to find these tiny islands, especially on these vast stretches of Pacific Ocean that they were crossing. You know, thousands of miles at a time, and aiming at these postage stamps, you know, sized islands in the middle of nowhere, and doing it in great you know, reliability and safety.
Yeah, and, you know, speaking of this notion of global travel, we have viewers joining in from all over the world, which is, I can't get over this map and seeing the extent of you all. So in the U.S., we have folks tuning in from all the way from Hawaii to the West Coast, up and down from Washington State to Southern California, and across through the Midwest, down to Florida, up along the East Coast, all the way up to Massachusetts, and then all through Canada. We also have viewers from the UK, Germany, Australia, Sweden, Poland, Norway, Netherlands, Japan, Finland, and Denmark. So it is, you know, in this notion of across the globe travel and sort of these pioneers in the aviation industry to 2019, where we can see in a screen in front of us how expansive, you know, communications have evolved over the last 81 years, and how that is enabling us to, you know, hopefully solve the mystery of what happened to the Samoan Clipper. And as we're looking at the sonar map, are we making a turn, or what are sort of these wavy-like formations going on here?
Yes, so we've just finished our line, number 5, and the ship has already started to turn, and Argus has caught up and finished the line, and it is also beginning to turn. So part of the process is, you know, moving Argus up and down based upon the terrain and the turn, and just the movement of the ship causes a distortion of the signal. So that's why we lose some of the signal quality, and we get these waves. We're also in a relatively hilly terrain as compared to the other side of the survey area.
And so just finishing up line 5, that means we have 4 left here in the southerly area of the survey region, and then our plan is to scan the rest of the southern portion and then transit back to the northern survey area, and we'll take Argus to pass over a couple of those targets that we deemed particularly interesting. So on average, we figured it takes us about 2 hours to go over each line. And in all, we've marked 44 targets. The last target we found was along a rocky edge to the east, and Dee Dee described it as a grouping of several smaller objects, some with parallel lines connecting them, which is really interesting. So, Dee Dee, why are we sort of looking at these groupings of particular objects versus, you know, like one big object?
So since we have some eyewitness accounts as far as what happened to the Samoan Clipper to cause it to land in the water and sink. But we anticipate that we're going to have larger pieces and smaller pieces. The thought is potentially the 118-foot-long wing section could be intact, but there's a lot of other structural material associated with the flying boat. So that's why we're looking for not only a larger item potentially, as well as the smaller pieces as the flying boat sunk and broke up, or broke up at the surface and sunk. So that's why we look for large and small and all pieces in between.
And do we have a few targets that are maybe more exciting than others?
Yes, so out of the 40 some odd targets at this point, we have a handful that are more interesting. And what we'll do is relook at those targets and come up with a priority list for Argus to pass back over as we head north to the other survey lines to get some cameras on them as we're in the same area headed by.
Cool. And then so once we get Argus on those targets in the northern area, at some point we'll bring Hercules back down to explore those more promising ones and get a better idea of sort of what we're working with here on the ocean floor. And, best case scenario, we find the Samoan Clipper and kind of, give ourselves the opportunity to close this chapter and lend some understanding to what happened. And, Russ, even if we don't find the Samoan Clipper, which, knocking on all the wood and crossing on all of our fingers, this still lends a huge breadth of knowledge to the scientific community and sort of our understanding of events like this, and how might this inform other accidents that have occurred in the past?
Well, yeah, I think just by doing this process of exploration and sharing it so openly, the way that is possible, through the platforms that Ocean Exploration Trust has created, it has spread this story, to many, hopefully thousands of people who had not been aware of it previously, and so brought some recognition of an unsung aviation pioneer and his entire crew. So it will have done that, and every second that we spend here, we are seeing portions of the Earth for the first time. I'm certain that no human eyes have ever regarded the images that we're seeing right now, and we'll have mapped a section of the ocean floor that was previously unknown, and helped build understanding about this particular area of the world, and how it fits into this ecosystem, and in relation to the National Marine Sanctuaries of American Samoa. And so it will have absolutely will have contributed valuable knowledge to in a variety of disciplines. Though it is still our intention and our goal to finally get the last pieces of the Samoan Clipper puzzle.
And I have to say, I had never heard of the Samoan Clipper before learning, and getting the expedition overview and details of what we were doing here. And in that short amount of time, I've totally become obsessed with this story. I mean, it's such an intriguing story, and I imagine your team has spent, half of a decade working on this, and you all have so much work and sort of involvement in the process, and here we are today.
Yeah. Well, and thank you all for being here. But yes, and being a part of it. It wouldn't be possible without this crew, and without all the people who have supported this throughout the years, from a variety of different organizations and individuals who have given of themselves and their knowledge and their passion to advance it. And yes, I mean, I have to say, I didn't know much at all about Samoan Clipper, before now, and I love this stuff, and I didn't know. In fact, when I first was thinking, first conceiving of the project at all I knew was that I recalled that something happened to Pan Am's chief pilot. I didn't even recall the name of the aircraft.
Oh wow!
And so it took some digging first to realize, what had happened, and then to start getting the story. And the more and more you look into it, the deeper we got into it, the more fascinating it became, and the opportunity to investigate and to perhaps write the final chapter was just irresistible. Especially when the opportunity was presented where Nautilus was going to be right where we needed it, and this is exactly the kind of thing why Air Sea Heritage Foundation was created in the first place, was to be able to investigate and share history like this. And so it's fitting. It's especially fitting though that it be carried out here on board Nautilus, given that the original impetus to investigate came from a workshop on identifying targets in the Eastern Pacific that was hosted by Ocean Exploration Trust and NOAA in San Francisco 5 years ago.
Wow, and in deciding what sort of notions get chosen, I imagine there's a lot that goes into that. How did you come to the decision, and how did OET and all of these other acting, organizations behind it? How did this decision to find the Samoan Clipper come to fruition?
Well, the project was really inaugurated, through Air Sea Heritage Foundation, and we really took the lead in doing the research and compiling it and coordinating all the planning, and it was a question of, or the decision was an easy one to make. Once we learned the story and appreciated its significance, and just what an incredible role Ed Musick had played in the early development of aviation and in the